Fake cops at my door. That's not something you ever expect to say out loud, but that's how this started. It was a Thursday morning, one of those ordinary, slightly gray ones where the sun hasn't quite made up its mind about showing up. My kitchen smelled of burnt coffee, the kind you keep reheating because you're too stubborn to pour it out. I was gratting papers at the table, trying to decide whether Jimmy's essay on the Civil War deserved the mercy of a C- instead of the D+ I'd penciled in. The house was quiet except for the hum of the fridge, the kind of silence that makes you notice every little sound outside. Then came the knock. Not the gentle kind neighbors use, not the impatient double tap of a delivery driver, 3 sharp raps, authoritative, practiced like someone had trained for it. My stomach tightened instantly. That sound doesn't ask for permission, it announces itself. For a split second I thought something terrible had happened. Maybe a death in the family, maybe taxes, maybe worse. I went to the peephole, and that's when my morning turned inside out. 3 uniforms. At first glance they looked official, navy blue pressed neat, shiny badges, belts that clinked like they carried weight. Their posture was textbook, shoulders back, feet apart, eyes scanning the street like they expected trouble. It was convincing, too convincing, theatrical. Still, I opened the door, and the first thing that hit me wasn't their authority, it was how new everything looked. Brand new fabric that hadn't seen a wash. Badges so polished they still caught every shard of morning light. Nowhere no scuffs, none of the subtle imperfections that real officers carry with them. The tallest one stepped forward, clipboard in hand. His voice was deep, confident. "Good morning, sir. We're here regarding your community compliance assessment." Even the words felt wrong. Community compliance assessment. It was like hearing a kid try to sound serious while playing dress-up. I teach history and government. I've seen plenty of fake signatures, forged permission slips, essays word for word from. My instincts screamed the same thing now. Something wasn't right. I asked which department sent them. Simple question. Their faces twitched. They looked at each other like students caught without the homework. The tall one cleared his throat. Community Enforcement Division. My skin crawled. 15 years of teaching civics, and I'd never heard those words strung together. Real agencies don't use vague titles. They're precise. Sheriff's Office, County Code Enforcement, State Police. This sounded made up, a phrase invented 5 minutes before they knocked. Behind me, I could hear my wife's footsteps. Had that stride, the one that meant she'd already assessed the situation before even seeing it. She was still in her robe, hair pulled back, eyes sharp as glass. She didn't say a word. She just stood behind me with her arms folded, watching. The men started pressing. "Routine compliance check," the leader repeated, trying to step closer. His eyes weren't on my porch. They were flicking into my living room, taking inventory like an appraiser. The shorter one shifted from foot to foot, nervous energy buzzing through him. The third guy barely spoke, kept glancing down the street like he was waiting for someone. I asked for identification. They handed me paperwork, glossy, official-looking, printed with micro dots and seals like they were trying to mimic government forms. But the phone number at the bottom went straight to a blank voicemail box. No department name, no human being on the other end. That's when stepped forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply reached into her robe pocket, pulled out her U.S. Marshal badge, and let it catch the light. The gold flared in the morning sun, unmistakable, undeniable. The transformation on their faces was instant. The tall one went pale. The nervous one actually stumbled backward a step, and the quiet one muttered something under his breath that sounded a lot like, "Oh, shit." No excuses, no arguments, just 3 men suddenly desperate to leave. They moved quick, brisk, purposeful, but not running, straight into a sedan parked at the curb. Tires squealed as they pulled away, leaving behind the smell of burning rubber and a half-empty mug of coffee I'd nearly dropped in the commotion. I stood there, heart hammering, holding their abandoned clipboard. Didn't even look at me at first. Her eyes stayed on the retreating car until it turned the corner. Then she finally exhaled, a long, slow breath, and said, "They weren't cops, not even close." I looked down at the paperwork, now stained with a splash of my coffee. The seal blurred into the brown smear, like even the paper was ashamed of itself. And in that moment, I knew 2 things for certain. First, this wasn't just some HOA neighborly dispute about lawn height or mailbox colors. Second, whoever sent those men hadn't expected to find a federal badge waiting behind the door. And that mistake was about to cost them more than they ever imagined. By the afternoon, I started second-guessing everything. Maybe I'd blown it out of proportion. Maybe those guys were just hired temps or some ridiculous prank. I kept staring at the stained paperwork on my counter, half convinced it would dissolve under the weight of my doubt. I sat on the front steps with a stack of essays I'd abandoned that morning, but I wasn't really reading. My mind replayed the knocks, the glances, the way they shifted on their feet like guilty kids caught sneaking out. The whole thing was absurd. Fake cops at my door, it sounded like a bad sitcom pitch. That's when I saw her pierce. She appeared at the end of my driveway with the kind of slow, deliberate walk people use when they've already practiced what they're about to say. Was our HOA treasurer and the self-appointed compliance chair. She had this ability to wear helpfulness like a costume, smiling, tilting her head just so, sprinkling her words with enough sympathy to seem harmless. But I'd seen her in meetings. She was sharp, strategic. This time she looked rehearsed. "Nate," she began, sliding herself onto my steps uninvited, "I heard about the mix-up this morning. I'm so sorry your family had to deal with that." Her tone was smooth, concerned, but her eyes kept flicking toward my front door. She continued, "Those pranksters weren't from us. I just wanted to make sure you knew that." Not from us, she emphasized it almost too much. The words landed heavy. Why deny so quickly? I hadn't accused her of anything. I asked, "So you know who they were?" Her mouth tightened just slightly, then relaxed into a sigh. "No idea, but I'll look into it internally. We can't have people impersonating HOA representatives." She pulled out a notepad, small, official-looking. That was strange. Normally handled everything through Facebook posts or sticky notes left on doors. Suddenly she was investigating internally. It didn't fit. What really unsettled me was her list of theories. Maybe it was local kids pulling a prank. Maybe a church outreach group in costume. Maybe even a film project gone wrong. Each suggestion was wrapped in concern, but it felt like she was steering me away from the truth, nudging me to write it off as nothing serious. And then she dropped the line. "I'd hate for this to escalate unnecessarily. You know, sometimes it's better to resolve things through proper community channels rather than involving outside authorities." That word, unnecessarily. It sat heavy in the air, like a warning disguised as neighborly advice. Mrs., who'd been watering her garden across the street, wandered over like she'd been waiting for her cue. "See, handling it properly," she announced, giving me a pointed look. "Some people rush to make everything a federal case when a little cooperation would solve the problem." The implication wasn't subtle. Some people, she meant me. Then another neighbor, came out of his house. He kept his distance but called over. "Why would anyone impersonate HOA people? Doesn't make sense. They don't even have much authority." That was the question. Why? If you're going to impersonate someone, why pick the HOA? Why not actual police? Jumped in quickly. Could be kids, could be scammers, we'll figure it out. But her tone was off, like she'd rehearsed this exact response. Eventually, she left with a promise to look into it quietly. Her smile lingered, but so did her eyes, scanning my windows one last time before she turned away. Later that evening, sat beside me on the steps, watching the same spot where it stood. She was downplaying everything, said flatly. Her law enforcement instincts were rarely wrong. The more I replayed it, the more I realized was right. Helpfulness hadn't been neighborly, it had been damage control. She'd been fishing for what I knew, steering me away from taking it seriously, trying to keep me quiet. That thought kept me awake most of the night. The next morning, I found myself in the least likely place to uncover more, a print shop. Our school copier had jammed again, and I needed 30 copies of a Constitution worksheet for my government class. So I went to Print Perfect, a strip mall shop squeezed between a nail salon and a sandwich place. I handed the master copy to the owner, an older guy who looked like he'd been fighting paper jams for decades. He held my worksheet up to the light, then muttered, "Funny, someone else brought in a document just like this yesterday. Real official looking, same glossy paper." My heart stopped. He disappeared into the back and came out with another sheet. My stomach dropped the second I saw it. A compliance assessment, identical to the one left on my porch. Same formatting, same fake seal. Same professional, intimidating tone designed to scare people into submission. But this one wasn't for me. It was addressed to another family in our neighborhood. A repair technician overheard us talking and joined in, pointing out the tiny yellow micro dots embedded in the paper. Those are printer signatures, he explained. Commercial machines leave them. You can tell exactly which printer made the document. He compared the dots on both papers, identical. Both came from the same machine. That was the moment everything shifted. This wasn't just about me. It wasn't random harassment. Multiple families were being targeted systematically with counterfeit documents printed on high-grade commercial equipment. I asked the technician to sign a statement confirming what he saw. He even showed me under magnification how the dots lined up. Evidence, real, physical evidence. Walking back to my car, I felt a cold clarity. This wasn't an HOA drama anymore. This was organized fraud. Someone with resources, planning, and intent was running a scheme across our entire neighborhood. And I just stumbled into the middle of it. That night, I spread the documents across our kitchen table like I was a detective in some late-night crime show. Coffee mugs, half-graded essays, and 2 fake compliance forms sat side by side under the glow of our kitchen light. I felt a strange mix of pride and dread. Pride because I had uncovered something real, dread because now I couldn't know it. Leaned against the counter, arms folded, scanning every page with that measured patience she always carried. After years in law enforcement, she could read paperwork the way other people read faces. "This isn't some neighborhood spat," she said finally. "This is fraud, organized fraud." Her words hit me like a verdict. Fraud, a crime with weight, a crime with prison time. We needed help, so I called Aaron Blake, an old friend of a deputy sheriff she'd worked with before she became a marshal. Aaron had that calm, no-nonsense voice that makes you believe things are manageable, even when they're not. I laid everything out, the fake cops, the paperwork, the print shop evidence. After a pause, he said, "That's solid. Document fraud, impersonation, targeting multiple victims. This isn't local. This is federal." Hearing him say it gave me a strange kind of relief. I wasn't crazy. My paranoia was justified. We weren't just imagining patterns. There was a case here. We spent an hour on the phone planning next steps. Document everything, preserve chain of custody, gather more evidence before going to prosecutors. It felt like progress, like maybe we were pulling ahead. But that's when I made my first mistake. We were still celebrating our little breakthrough when I noticed a man standing on the sidewalk outside. He wasn't pretending to be a jogger or a dog walker. He was just standing there looking down at his phone, but angled so he could see our house. Watching. I tried to tell myself it was coincidence, but then he walked up to our door with the stiff posture of someone who thought he had authority. When I opened it, he introduced himself smoothly. "Enforcement Division, assigned to your case." Enforcement Division, the same made-up phrase again. My stomach dropped. Still, instead of slamming the door, I let him talk. Worse, I let him pull information out of me. I was too confident, too eager to show off the work I'd done. I told him about the copy shop, the microdots, the evidence folders. I told him we'd spoken to Aaron Blake. I told him we were preparing to go federal. And he just nodded, asked quiet little follow-up questions, letting me believe I was winning. But in reality, I was briefing the enemy on everything we knew, every step we were planning. When he left, he said, "We'll expect compliance soon. Escalation's unnecessary if you cooperate." As he walked away, I snapped a photo of his badge and license plate. Exhibits, I thought, more proof. I actually felt good about it. But an hour later, Aaron called back, his voice sharp with urgency. "Nate, I just checked. There's no such division anywhere. You didn't give him details, did you?" My chest went cold. I had every detail. Aaron's tone shifted into something I'd never heard from him before, fear. "That wasn't enforcement, Nate. That was counterintelligence. You just told them everything." I felt the blood drain from my face. All that work, all those little victories, gone. I just armed them with our playbook. The next morning, I saw the fallout. Mrs., who usually waved at me while gardening, suddenly looked the other way. Not casual avoidance, but deliberate, like she'd rehearsed it. Mr., who always stopped to talk about school board politics, crossed the street when he saw me. Parents who'd let their kids play basketball in our driveway now kept them in their yards. It was like a switch had flipped overnight. Conversations hushed when I walked by. Words like troublemaker and making false accusations drifted in whispers I wasn't meant to hear. My reputation was being poisoned systematically. And at the center of it all was, I overheard her one afternoon by the mailbox, speaking to a small cluster of neighbors in that tone of reluctant concern. "I've tried to handle this diplomatically," she said, "but some people insist on escalating minor issues unnecessarily." Unnecessarily. There it was again, that loaded word. I went home that night feeling hollow. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was the problem neighbor, the one who couldn't let things go. Maybe if I just paid the fine, dropped the investigation, all of it would disappear. Found me in the backyard, staring at the fence like it held answers. She sat down beside me, her voice calm but firm. "This is classic. Isolate the target, make them doubt themselves, strip away their support before the real attack." Her words sank in slowly. They weren't just making me unpopular, they were breaking me down strategically. And then, by sheer accident, I got proof. 2 houses down, a neighbor kept a police scanner running while tinkering in his garage. That night, as I passed by, static crackled, and then a familiar voice slipped through the air. Clear as day, confirm isolation protocol effective. Walker family appears demoralized. Community support neutralized. Proceed to final extraction phase. I froze in the driveway, the hair on my arms rising. Final extraction phase. The voice followed, calm, professional. Walker shared operational timeline and federal contacts. Recommend acceleration before prosecution becomes irreversible. I fumbled for my phone, recorded the audio, logged the frequency. Proof, chilling, undeniable proof. This wasn't gossip or neighbor drama. This was organized, tactical, professional. And the phrase, final extraction, echoed in my skull long after the transmission ended. What did that mean? What exactly were they planning for us? The morning the extraction phase started, the air felt heavy, like the sky had been warned in advance. I woke before the alarm, the house still stitched with the thin light that comes before dawn. Was already up, quietly moving through the kitchen with that purposeful calm she always has when she's thinking in law enforcement mode. Coffee, checklist, scan the perimeter. She didn't say much, just handed me a thermal blanket and a small roll of evidence tape like they were ordinary morning things. They weren't ordinary. We'd agreed to be surgical about everything now. No bluster, no grandstanding. We were collecting confirmation, not revenge. The stakes had been raised the minute Aaron told us federal prosecutors needed hard proof within 48 hours, and the whole neighborhood suddenly felt like a chessboard with too many pieces missing. The first sign something had shifted was how quiet the street was. Normally, morning traffic drones along by 7. Today, only a single delivery truck coughed up the road, its engine rasping, distant. Neighbors who normally took early walks were absent, their porches empty. When I stepped outside to check the mailbox, the gate at the front of our cul-de-sac creaked as if someone had left it ajar on purpose. The metal groaned a long, lonely sound that echoed down the block. Little things started to feel loaded. Dust on boots left by a passerby could be a clue. An unfamiliar scuff on the mailbox could be evidence. Paranoia and attention were easy to confuse. We had a plan, more documentation, more corroboration. Called Aaron to give him the coordinates of where we planned to access stored HOA materials, storage the community technically owned, which made it legal for residents to access during reasonable hours. There's a fine line between breaking in and exercising a right. We were staying on the right side of it. My fob key clicked in the lock like a promise. The sound felt loud in the stillness. Walking to the storage facility, I felt every loose gravel tootling under my shoes. My boots picked up tiny specks of ash from someone's earlier cigarette. The tack of a neighbor's tire left a ribbon of darker dust in the gravel. These were stupid details, almost ridiculous, but they'd become my landscape. I noticed a neighbor's stoop light left on, someone forgetful or someone watching. The storage building doors sighed open with a metallic breath, the hinges complaining as if they hadn't been used in a while. Inside, stale air smelled of paper and dust and old wood, evident smells like laundry detergent next to the real thing. The boxes were where we'd been told they'd be, labeled in tidy block letters, community compliance, maintenance logs, seasonal decorations. But one stack hit my gut. Hidden between holiday wreath boxes and outdated bylaws were hundreds of pre-printed compliance assessment forms, identical to the ones left at our door. The paper was glossy, heavy, the sort of stock used for professional mailers, not the kind of thing the average HOA volunteer would assemble on a laptop. Printer signatures matched the samples from Print Perfect. There were receipts, payments to an outfit called Community Enforcement Services, and authorization forms with names signed in a looping hand. It was a slow revelation, like peeling away wallpaper to find rot. Each item we photographed felt like turning a key in a lock. Radios, professional grade, sealed in cases, had frequency lists, stickers with call signs, and logged operating schedules. Schedules containing times when teams would be deployed to particular streets and targeted households. There were spreadsheets that read like a business plan, projected revenue from insurance manipulations, expected returns on manufactured fines, even notes about community members deemed low risk versus high return. Paper after paper laid out a criminal enterprise with spreadsheets and projections that would have made a corporate accountant nod in approval. At one point, I found a ledger. It was the kind of thing you'd expect in a dim back office of a business laundering money, columned neat, each line an entry for cash payments, kickbacks, and reimbursements. Names, dates, amounts tucked away in plain sight. The numbers weren't random, they told the story of motive. Someone had sat down, opened a spreadsheet, and planned to profit from people who believed their homes were safe. The betrayal felt physical. Even with my training as a teacher, used to sniffing out plagiarism and half-truths, this felt like a different language. This was corporate malice. It was a plan. And now that we had physical proof, I realized why the radio had said extraction. Extraction wasn't about moving a person. It was about extracting value, money, insurance payouts, control of property markets by preying on trust and authority. We took photos of everything. I labeled files, assigned exhibit numbers out loud like a broken metronome. The storage room's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, making everything look slightly washed out and unreal, like a scene from a documentary. Dusted a box for fingerprints out of habit. We both laughed briefly at the absurdity of trust and law colliding in a dusty community storage room. But the laugh had an edge. This wasn't funny. Not anymore. We cataloged pages and locked up the storage, performing every step with careful chain of custody rituals Aaron had instructed us on. The fob clicked again. The hinges complained as we left, the same breath we'd heard before, now a witness to what had been there. Outside, the cul-de-sac felt smaller, like a stage where the props had been rearranged while we weren't looking. A neighbor's curtain twitched like a spectator peeking from behind a hand. That afternoon, the phone calls began. Federal investigators wanted copies. Aaron wanted us to hand-deliver the most sensitive files. I remember driving past the mailbox and seeing Mrs. outside, watering her roses in the same careful rhythm she always had. She looked up and our eyes met. For a second, she hesitated. Was that a flicker of shame or a practiced neutrality? I couldn't tell. Then she lowered her gaze and went back to her plants. It felt like a small surrender, or perhaps the first seed of awareness. By evening, federal agents were at our doorstep, professional, the sort of presence that made the house feel like someone else's now. They moved with a quiet routine, asking measured questions, taking statements, shaking their heads at the ledger photos. The lead investigator's voice was careful but firm when she said, "You did the right thing documenting everything. This is enough to move forward." Her words landed like a weight being lifted, and also like a reminder that the fight wasn't over. Evidence could win a case, but people had to feel safe again. That night in bed, I thought about how fragile the public's trust is. One forged badge, one glossy paper, and a network of willing collaborators could move a whole block to fear. I turned over and watched the ceiling, listening to the refrigerator hum, thinking about the small comforts that had been hijacked by greed. Sometimes justice is slow and clinical. Sometimes it moves with the precision of paperwork in courtrooms and forensic prints. But in those early hours, it had a human face, methodical and steady. Aaron, the voice of reason, neighbors weeping quietly when they heard, and the knowledge that the ordinary rituals of mourning, coffee, mail, children catching buses, had been weaponized against us. I slept badly, but I slept. We had evidence now, and evidence had a kind of gravity. It pulled the community back toward truth, even if only a little at a time. And in the morning, when the first neighbor came by with 2 paper bags of grocery store cookies, I felt something shift. It wasn't victory, not yet. But it was the slow, awkward first step toward repair, and the creak of that gate, once ominous, sounded a little less like a threat and more like a hinge opening on the possibility of trust rebuilt. The next morning, the phone rang before sunrise. Not a friendly call, not even a neighbor checking in. It was Aaron. His voice had that clipped tone, the one that skips past greetings and goes straight to the problem. "Federal prosecutor needs hard evidence within 48 hours, he said. "If you don't deliver, the case drops to the state, and you don't want that. Too light, they'll walk." I sat there at the kitchen table, coffee cooling in my hands, staring at the fake compliance form I'd pinned under a magnet on the fridge. 48 hours. That was nothing. I'd barely gotten my head around the idea this was organized crime, and now I was supposed to gather a federal case file on a clock. Leaned against the counter, arms crossed, listening. She didn't need to say anything. Her expression told me what I already knew. We didn't have the luxury of packing ourselves anymore. We had to move. The urgency had bled into everything. Every sound felt sharper. The slam of the mailbox door, the creak of the gate, even the distant barking of a neighbor's dog felt like a countdown. I tried to focus on grading, but the words on my students' essays blurred into nothing but lines. My mind was elsewhere, back in that storage room, on the ledger pages, on the voices we'd heard over the scanner. That afternoon, and I met with our insurance representative. We wanted to know if our homeowner's policy could cover any damage from what we'd uncovered. I expected it to be routine, a professional conversation in a quiet office. Something normal, something grounding. At first it was. She greeted us with efficiency, offered coffee, clicked through our file like she'd done a dozen times before. She even nodded sympathetically when I explained we were under stress from community disputes. But the moment I mentioned the evidence, multiple families receiving identical forged documents, microdots linking them to one printer, her demeanor shifted. Her interest sharpened. She started asking very specific questions. "So you've documented these, multiple addresses, all matching?" Her pen scratched fast on her notepad, more like a stenographer than someone helping us review policy coverage. I felt a flicker of pride. Finally, someone outside law enforcement taking us seriously, but wasn't smiling. Her eyes narrowed, following the movements of the woman's hands. And then I saw it too. Her phone lit up on the desk beside her. A text. The screen was tilted just enough that I caught the preview before she swiped it away. "Walker meeting noted. Update files per agreed parameters, MP." Pierce. I felt my stomach drop, a weight so sudden it made my hands tremble. The person I'd trusted for years with my family's insurance details, our property records, our financial vulnerabilities, she wasn't neutral. She was in it. When I asked about the message, her polished mask cracked for the briefest moment. Her hand darted protectively toward her phone. Then she recovered, voice smooth. "I coordinate with many community representatives to ensure accurate risk assessments." Risk assessments. The phrase that had sounded bland in other meetings now felt poisonous. Shifted her weight and pulled out her phone. Her voice was steady, almost cold. "This conversation is being recorded. Any statements regarding fraudulent coordination are now evidence." For the first time, the insurance rep looked rattled. Her pen stilled. Her breathing quickened just slightly, and that's when the whole picture snapped into place. The fraudulent assessments, the fake compliance teams, the intimidation, they weren't tricks. They were part of a larger revenue machine. Manufacture violations, threaten families, feed those violations into insurance reports. Use them to raise premiums, deny claims, even justify foreclosures. Money funneled through fear, all under the mask of procedure. It was breathtaking in its audacity, and it was working. I sat there realizing how deep this betrayal went. She had access to our most sensitive data, mortgage details, property appraisals, personal info that could be twisted into leverage. For years, I'd trusted her signature more than my own. And now, every increase in our premiums, every sudden change in coverage looked like part of the scam. We pressed her for details. She tried to dodge, but law enforcement instincts cornered her. Every phrase she used community factors, cooperative reporting. Risk alignment was jargon meant to sanitize fraud, and under pressure she admitted enough. Enough to confirm that multiple properties had been targeted, enough to establish that kickbacks flowed to HOA leadership, enough to prove systematic conspiracy. When we left that office, my hands were still shaking, not from fear but from anger. The kind of anger that sits in your chest like a storm, heavy and electric. Aaron's assessment when we called him was blunt. Insurance fraud across multiple states, that's big, that's federal racketeering territory. His voice carried weight. You're not just dealing with crooked neighbors anymore, you're in the middle of an enterprise. And yet, with all that validation, all that evidence, I still felt a knot in my stomach. Because if they'd infiltrated insurance, how much further did it go? Banks, real estate agencies, local officials, who else had been bought? That night, lying awake, I thought about betrayal. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies, but the subtle kind. The smile from across a desk. The handshake that hides a knife. The familiar voice telling you, don't worry, it's all routine, while quietly filing you into a profit column. The walls of my own home felt thinner, like even they were listening. I heard the gate creak again in the wind, and for the first time I wondered if they had already calculated our family into one of those spreadsheets. A line item, a number, a target. 48 hours. That was all we had to turn their own paper trail against them. And the clock was already ticking. They wanted proof in 48 hours. That sentence crawled around my skull like a fly, constant, impossible to ignore. It turned every choice into a calculation, risk versus reward, speed versus thoroughness, pride versus safety. The deadline flattened the world into tasks. Gather this, photograph that, preserve the chain, move fast, don't get sloppy. Don't make mistakes. We'd already found the storage cache, the ledgers, the radios. But Aaron and the federal team wanted corroboration, paper trails that tied payments to bank accounts, communications that showed coordination across defendants, anything that turned suspicion into indictment. That meant peeking past the obvious and into the places people thought were private. It meant asking for records, chasing emails, and yes, taking chances I'd never imagined myself taking. I remember standing at the sink that morning, the mug warm and forgotten in my hand, watching the steam curl up and dissolve. Sat across from me, map of exhibits open on the table, her face a mask of calm calculation. "We'll do this legally," she said. "We don't break in, we don't bait them into anything. We move within the law, but we move fast." Her hands were steady as always, but I could see the strain at the edges of her jaw. This wasn't just paperwork for her. It was a promise to keep our family safe. We started with the things that didn't require subterfuge. Emails, payment receipts, call logs, names I could find in public records, called in favors, old contacts who still owed her small debts of trust from years in uniform. One by one, they checked databases, ran preliminary subpoenas through the federal office, and came back with fragments. A money transfer here, a shadow account there, a phone number tied to a PO box instead of a person. Each fragment felt both like progress and like admitting how deep the rot ran. Time was a predator. We moved from one lead to the next like people trying to chase a storm. In the margins of the day, I tried to keep up with life, gratting, breakfast, a morning school bell that still needed me, but ordinary rhythms strained under the weight of extraordinary tasks. Students asked about essays. My replies came clipped, automatic. At pickup, a neighbor smiled and I felt it like a fossilized, distant thing. My sleep grew thin and strategic. 30 minutes of dozing, an hour awake, then another sliver of rest, always with one ear tuned to the world. We also had to manage the social war. Isolation had done its work. Neighbors had been primed to distrust us. Now we needed allies. I started with small human things, neighborly favors, cups of sugar, shared dog walks that weren't into for leverage. It wasn't manipulation, it was repair. People respond to steadiness. They answer to someone who shows up. Slowly, conversations returned. Mrs. brought over a pie, and when I opened the door, her eyes were wet. "I'm so sorry," she said, voice cramped with something like shame. The apology settled in my chest heavier than I'd expected. It mattered. It meant the social web was mendable. It meant we weren't alone. But there were close calls. One night, as I slipped back to our house with a flash drive full of scanned documents, I noticed a sedan idling at the corner. Headlights off, throwing the car into a pool of shadow. My heart did that weird flip you get when something's wrong and you can't tell what. For a second I froze, counting possible exits in my head, practical, useless instincts when adrenaline floods reasoning. Then the car eased away, almost casual, like someone checking a watch and deciding to leave. I gripped the drive until it bent in my hand. The drive became Exhibit 99 in my mental inventory. Everything became evidence to guard. At the federal office, the investigators moved like professionals who'd done this before. They asked clean questions, the sort that separate noise from signal. Who had access to financial accounts? Where did payments originate? When were these radios purchased? Who signed the receipts? Subpoenas went out. The bureaucratic language felt sterile compared to the urgency in my chest, but it was necessary. Paperwork could cut the roots of a network if you found the right lines of ledger to tug. The defendant list slowly grew. Names I'd heard in passing began to recombine into an organization chart in my head. At the top, running enforcement ops, the insurance rep acting as the financial node. There were others, people with safer public faces, volunteers, contractors, even a vendor who'd installed community signs. The more names that fit the pattern, the more terrifying the scale looked. This wasn't a few bad apples. This was a machine. On the third night, with the clock grinding down like a metronome, I made another plan that felt dangerous but lawful. HOA records, minutes, invoices, contracts were technically public under certain conditions. The HOA office closed hours ago, but the community binder in the library and the records in the municipal filing system were accessible. We scheduled our visits, me to the municipal records department, to speak with a reluctant clerk she'd once helped in a case years ago. We were exhausting legal avenues, because every legal avenue was one less thing we couldn't be accused of when the defendants argued fabrication. The municipal clerk looked at the stack of requests like a mountain, and then after a long pause she began to pull files. Old vendor invoices, check stubs, a purchase order for radios issued to Community Enforcement Services, signed by an unfamiliar hand. I felt the room tilt as each paper hit the table. It was bureaucracy's own kind of revelation, small holes in the facade where signatures and dates revealed intent. I photographed everything with the solemnity of someone reading a will. At home, with evidence mounting, the stress hit in quiet, human ways. Our daughter asked why Dad was always tired. I tried to explain in words she'd understand there are people who tried to scare us. We're making sure they can't do it to anyone else. The simplicity of the explanation felt like an apology and a promise wrapped together. Later that night, she drew a picture of our family in a small square at the top of a paper, houses with smiling faces. I taped it to the refrigerator next to Exhibit 1, the stained, fake compliance form. It kept me honest. It reminded me that there are things worth risking normal for. When noon of the last full day arrived, we had a stack of exhibits that made my hands cry silently. Bank records, scans of receipts, audio files of the radio chatter, photos of the storage room, notarized statements from the print shop tech. We had the municipal invoices and a trail linking payments to P.O. boxes and shell companies. We even had a recorded admission. One of the insurance reps' offhand comments captured during the meeting, blunt and damning when placed beside the financials. We drove the evidence to the federal office in a single, tense trip. The car felt too small for the burden. An investigator met us in a glassed foyer and took the drive with a solemn nod. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. She opened a chain of custody log, signed exhibit numbers, and then looked at us the way people look at folks who done something hard but necessary. "This is enough to get a grand jury," she said, and the words landed like something heavy finally finding purchase. There was a rush, equal parts relief and terror. Relief because the papers we'd rushed, the risks we'd taken within legal lines, had a path to justice. Terror because indictments would mean public trials, smear campaigns, and maybe retaliation. The house felt too quiet on the ride home, like the city had paused and was waiting to see what would happen next. That night we ate cold pizza and watched the street light crawl across the floor. We didn't celebrate. We didn't allow ourselves triumph. Instead, we breathed. The air we drew was less sharp than it had been for weeks. For the first time in a long while, I let myself imagine our daughter running through a yard where neighbors smiled without calculating motives. There's a strange clarity that comes from walking toward something dangerous for the sake of ordinary things. Family dinners, a kid's laughter, the safe hum of a fridge. It made me think of a line said once. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't confronting the bully, it's showing up the next day and being ordinary anyway. We showed up ordinary the next morning, but ordinary had teeth now. Ordinary had paperwork, witnesses, and a federal investigator's signature. And the world, for all its threats, felt a little more like it would bend toward justice than away. 3 weeks later, I found myself sitting in the hard wooden benches of a federal courtroom. The fluorescent lights hummed above, casting everything in that sterile brightness that makes time feel slower than it really is. I wasn't a teacher that morning. I wasn't even a homeowner. I was a witness, a plaintiff, a reluctant custodian of the truth. The evidence we'd scrambled to collect under a 48-hour deadline had been enough, more than enough. The federal prosecutors had built a case so airtight it could have suffocated in its own paperwork. Every exhibit numbered, every chain of custody preserved. They even played the scanner audio, his voice cutting through the speakers like a ghost we'd all been forced to live with. Confirm isolation protocol effective. Proceed to final extraction phase. I watched her across the room. She didn't look like the queen bee of an HOA anymore. She looked small, ordinary, hands folded, eyes darting to the judge, then down to the table, then back again. I remembered the way she'd perched herself on my front steps with that rehearsed concern, and for the first time I realized how much of her power had come from the stage she'd built around herself. Without it, she was just another defendant in a cheap suit. The judge read the charges like a drumbeat. Mail fraud, wire fraud, impersonation of law enforcement, insurance fraud, conspiracy. Each one carried weight, not just for the law but for us, the families who'd lived under her manipulation. Every time the judge said guilty, it felt like another brick being removed from the wall they'd built around our neighborhood. Didn't fare better. His military bearing, once intimidating, now worked against him. The judge called it an aggravating factor, specialized training used against civilians. He sat stiff, jaw clenched, but I saw his shoulders sink with each sentence handed down. 18 months in federal prison, fines, restitution, his career, his carefully crafted image, stripped away. The insurance representative looked almost relieved when her sentence came. 12 months, restitution, a permanent mark on her professional record. She didn't fight it, didn't plead. Maybe she knew the evidence was insurmountable. Maybe betrayal eats you from the inside even before the punishment arrives. When the judge finally dismissed us, I didn't cheer. None of us did. Federal courtrooms don't inspire cheering. They inspire silence. A silence that carries weight, like everyone, waiting for the echo of justice to settle into the cracks. Walking out into the crisp air, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Normal sunlight. Not suspicious, not ominous, just light. Reached for my hand, squeezed it once. We didn't need words. But the real weight didn't lift until the following week, when the U.S. Attorney's Office sent letters to every household in our community. They explained the conspiracy in plain language, listed the crimes, cleared the names of families who had been smeared. Reading those words, systematic manipulation, criminal fraud, restitution provided, was like having a stone removed from my chest. Neighbors began to reappear. Mrs. was the first. She walked up my driveway holding a Tupperware container of homemade cookies, her expression equal parts apology and regret. "I should have trusted you instead of the rumors," she said, her voice shaky. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, and she pressed the container into my hands like it was her own peace treaty. Mr. followed a few days later, organizing a neighborhood barbecue in our backyard. For the first time since the nightmare began, laughter floated across property lines again. Kids ran between yards, neighbors passed plates, someone fired up a grill that hadn't been touched all summer. Raised a plastic cup halfway through and said, "You could stayed quiet, paid the fake fines, instead you fought, not just for yourself, for all of us." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words heavier than the smoke curling into the sky. Federal recognition came too, though it didn't mean as much as the backyard did. A letter from the U.S. Attorney's Office framed commendation, acknowledgement of my role in exposing organized criminal enterprise. It was formal, official. I hung it in my study, but the thing that stuck wasn't the paper. It was the moment a neighbor's child ran past me laughing, chasing a ball like nothing had ever been wrong. That was the real commendation. The HOA itself underwent surgery, fraudulent violations expunged, policies rewritten, legal counsel required for any enforcement action, federal compliance audits scheduled every quarter. The signs that once declared community patrol were torn down, their metal poles left bare like relics of a lie. For me, the victory was quieter. I framed the original fake compliance form, the one with the coffee stain, beside our coffee maker. A scar turned into a trophy. Every morning when I poured my cup, it reminded me, question suspicious authority, trust the process, protect the community. Sometimes I caught myself staring at it longer than I should, remembering the knock, the gleam of fake badges, the way Marshal credentials had cut through the charade. That piece of paper had started everything. Now it ended up as a lesson, ugly, stained, but real. The FBI asked permission to use our case as a training tool. They said it illustrated the way criminal enterprises exploit trust, authority, and bureaucracy all at once. Somewhere out there, agents were flipping through copies of our exhibits, studying the same microdots, listening to the same scanner recordings. What started as a nightmare on my porch had become a textbook example of fraud prevention. The neighborhood didn't heal overnight, trust never does, but little by little it returned. Conversations at mailboxes turned casual again, invitations slipped into mail slots, children shouted each other's names across fences. Suspicion faded, replaced by something sturdier, awareness. And me, I went back to grading papers at the kitchen table, coffee growing cold, red pens scratching across essays. But my students noticed something different. When we covered constitutional rights, due process, citizen responsibility, I spoke with a conviction I hadn't had before, not because of theory, because I'd lived it. The line I repeated most often was simple. Authority deserves respect, but only when it's real. I'd learned that the hard way, and so had my neighbors. The night after the sentencing, I sat on the back porch long after everyone had gone to bed. The air carried that cool hush that only comes when a neighborhood has finally exhaled. Crickets murmured in the distance. The gate creaked once in the wind, but this time it didn't raise my heartbeat. It was just wood and metal, no longer a weapon of fear. I thought back to the first knock on our door. The fake uniforms, the fake authority. The way my hands had trembled while I tried to look braver than I felt. So much had changed since that morning, and yet if you looked around our street, it was the same. Mailboxes lined neatly, porch lights glowing, the smell of fresh-cut grass carried in the air. That was the cruel trick of it all, how ordinary life had masked the extraordinary deceit happening beneath it. Stepped outside, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She didn't say anything at first, just sat beside me, the weight of her presence grounding me. After a while, she whispered, "You know, most people would folded, paid the fine, moved on." I shook my head. I almost did. If it wasn't for you, I probably would have. Her hand found mine, warm, steady. But you didn't, and now a whole community can breathe again. Her words sank deep, but I didn't feel like a hero. I felt human, flawed. I'd made mistakes. I'd tipped my hand to. I'd doubted myself when the neighbors turned away. I'd nearly given up. But maybe that was the point. Justice doesn't come from perfection. It comes from refusing to stay silent even when you're afraid. The following week, I returned to teaching full-time. The classroom buzzed with ordinary chaos. Students swapping snacks, someone tapping a pencil against the desk, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. I handed out worksheets on civil liberties, the irony not lost on me. One student raised her hand and asked, "Mr. Walker, do people really lose their homes because of small fines?" I paused. For the first time, I didn't have to answer hypothetically. I told them about due process, about how law protects us when it's applied honestly, and about what happens when it's exploited. I didn't tell them the whole story that belonged to adults, but I did tell them this. Never assume a badge makes someone right. Truth makes them right. The classroom went quiet, students scribbling notes, some starring like I'd just handed them a secret. Maybe I had. Life slowly rethreaded itself. Mail arrived without dread. HOA newsletters actually contain news, gardening tips, pool schedules, reminders about recycling. Boring, safe, exactly what an HOA should be. Sometimes I caught myself smiling at the dullness of it all. Boring was a gift. But healing wasn't just about paperwork or barbecues. It was in the awkward, hesitant conversations with neighbors. Mrs. started waving again, though it took her weeks to meet my eyes. Mr. stopped crossing the street and even asked my opinion about school policies again. A family that had once pulled their kids from our yard showed up at our door with a thank you card written in a child's scrawl. "Thanks for making it safe again." Those small gestures stitched back the fabric faster than any federal letter could. Of course, scars remain. Some neighbors moved away, unwilling to keep living where it all happened. A few friendships never recovered fully, the betrayal too deep to patch. And late at night, when the house creaks, I still sometimes flash back to flat voice at my doorstep. "Enforcement division, assigned to your case." Those words live somewhere in the marrow now. But I've learned to live with scars. They're not weaknesses, they're proof you survived. One evening, weeks later, I pulled that framed compliance form off the wall, Exhibit 1, coffee stain and all. I studied it in silence. It didn't look scary anymore, it looked pathetic. A flimsy attempt to intimidate, to control. Yet it had almost worked. Almost. I carried it outside to the fire pit, and our daughter joined me. We didn't say a word as I set it on the logs and struck a match. The paper curled, edges blackening, the fake seal crumbling into ash. We watched until nothing remained but embers glowing against the dark. My daughter asked softly, "Does this mean it's over?" I knelt beside her, brushing soot from my hands. "It means we don't let it happen again." The flames crackled, sending sparks into the night sky. Sparks that would fade, but for a brief moment, they looked like stars rising from the earth. I realized then that the story wasn't really about fraud or fake cops or even indictments. It was about something older, deeper: trust. How fragile it is, how easily it can be broken, and how, when people fight for it, it can be rebuilt, even stronger than before. Sometimes the strongest communities aren't the ones that never face betrayal. They're the ones that stare betrayal in the face, survive it, and come out refusing to let fear define them. As the fire died down, I thought of the moral I carry for the rest of my life. Dignity doesn't always look like pride. Sometimes it looks like persistence. Sometimes it looks like standing at your front door with trembling hands and saying no, even when your voice shakes. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, and neither was I, but we had our ordinary lives back. And ordinary, I'd learned, was the most extraordinary victory of all. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next mystery on HOA Hunter Stories.